So, how do we cultivate a resilient and responsive distributed design community? From August through October, Fab Lab Barcelona is hosting a weekly online chat series where guests share their personal experiences of responding to moments of crisis. And the aim is to collaboratively work on a shared vision, aligned values, and develop best practices. This is Resilient Maker Stories. I'm Jean-Luc. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for sharing your lunch with us today, your breakfast with us today. Yeah, let's get started. So the Resilient Maker Stories is part of the Reservist project, which comes out of the distributed design platform. And distributed design is actually a concept that is one outcome of the intersection of two global trends, the maker movement and the digitization of the design discipline. Also coming out of the distributed design platform is the book Viral Design. And the book itself is named after a paper which was written by Enrico Bassi, who we heard from last week, in which he argues that all situations that occur on a global scale that are not met with effective responses in industrial production system could be approached from the way that we have seen distributed mobilization in the COVID-19 crisis. They could be the next testing ground for a synchronized international response from a global network. And so the Reservist project itself, the aim of our research is to repurpose manufacturing lines for providing medical and other products and services in the case of spiking demand times. So for example, this approach is to set up so-called reservist cells that in times of crises can be activated within 48 hours to switch to produce the necessary products and services. And so this series is actually part of the Master in Design for Emergent Futures, the research residency in this. So this is a proposal that came out of that research residency. And of course, Jean-Luc, me, I am one of the alumni of the MDEF program. But also coming out of MDEF is the Atlas of Weak Signals. And so relevant to the Reservist project, we've actually customized the Atlas of Weak Signals deck, which is used in MDEF to do futures research towards the prototyping of social interventions. We actually customized that deck to actually have this deck here where we're talking about natural disasters, pandemics, man-made disasters, war and terrorism, or digital blackout. So what can we do with this deck to actually have this as a tool for people, for frontline stakeholders to actually be able to map out their own experiences and sort of chart out a path to scale their interventions and be ready for any unexpected events. And so that brings us to today's speaker, Andrew Lamb. So I'm going to pull up my notes here. Andrew is a Global Innovation Lead at International Humanitarian Relief Organization Field Ready, Chair of the Internet of Production Alliance, and Director of Massive Small Manufacturing Limited. Andrew has previously worked on sustainability and sustainable development issues as Chief Executive of Engineers Without Borders and as a consultant to UNESCO, the World Bank, and the global bodies for engineering profession. His work is now all about enabling distributed local manufacturing and the benefits that it can bring. He lives in London and he loves Lego. So thank you so much for joining us today, Andrew. I'm going to stop our screen share and we'll start our conversation.
Thanks, Jean-Luc, and I'm delighted by this project and to be able to share thoughts with you, and to build on some of the work that Enrico Bassi and others have contributed before. These people, someone like Enrico Bassi has been a real inspiration to me.
Yes, thank you. So I gave like a little bit of your background in that bio there. Can you kick us off about like your background in humanitarian work and then working with manufacturing lines?
Absolutely. I think the work of Field Ready is very much about trying to transform the way aid and emergency response is normally done. It's about trying to innovate within humanitarian supply chains with the basic idea that depending on what you're making, which is a big factor, it is often cheaper, better, and faster to manufacture locally than to bring in supplies from outside. And there's all sorts of factors involved in this, scale being the main one, which is why I got involved in an initiative called the Internet of Production, trying to scale out production rather than scale up production. So when we think about manufacturing production lines for aid supplies, we often think about batch sizes of one. So a production line that is based on economies of scope, that's using the same equipment to make lots of different things, than a production line in the traditional sense, which is based on economies of scale, making the same thing over and over again. Mm-hmm. However, more recently, Field Ready has moved from, say, 3D printing, individual umbilical cord clamps, which is where we started back in 2014, in a clinic, through to working with factories in countries to be able to rapidly retool a factory and to be able to add to a product portfolio in a traditional mass production process. But the crucial thing is that factory is local to where the need is, rather than, say, on the other side of the planet. My own journey, I'm a systems and information engineer. I'm not a manufacturing engineer. I'm barely a maker, in the sense that I do a lot of DIY and I do electronics and things. I did when I was a boy. But the thing that I make at the moment more than anything else is projects and programs to test out different experiments in the concept of resilient making. And that ranges from plastic recycling to procurement initiatives to just designing the COVID response programs using by networking together local needs and suppliers, a range of different things. And I actually am speaking to you this week, Jean-Luc, in my last week at Field Ready. I finish with Field Ready, my time with Field Ready at the end of this week, after I got involved in it about 10 years ago, when it was an idea, a brilliant one. And I'm now moving on to the Internet of Production, which is about trying to create networks of resilient manufacturing and making. We're trying to create the infrastructures that, quite frankly, an organization like Field Ready needs to exist in the world if it's going to be able to do its responses.
Mm-hmm. No, it's good to know that that we're kind of like timely in this conversation. Then, I did want to just kind of touch base on sort of like the emergency crisis scenario, the premise of the series. So we have like all of those different scenarios that we mapped out in the Atlas of Weak Signals, and of course, like through your time with Field Ready and now going into internet production, you've seen like the COVID-19 crisis, but I feel like there's also been an intersection during that time of different emergency crisis scenarios. So can you talk us a little bit about like the different scenarios that you've approached in your work?
The place where our innovation of locally manufacturing aid supplies has been most effective are places where traditional supply chains are at the worst. The globalized systems of production depend on supply chains that are highly efficient and therefore not necessarily resilient, can be quite fragile, but they supply rich populations that are highly concentrated, say a place like London, where essentially labor costs are high, where it makes sense to bring stuff from outside. That isn't necessarily where Field Ready's been working. We've been working in contexts that are remote, where supply chain challenges are overwhelming, where they are the biggest challenges, and places where initially where engineering capabilities were very low and populations were very small. So we've been talking about working in the Himalayas in Nepal after the 2015 earthquakes, working in responses in the South Pacific, working across many of the island nations in the South Pacific, and in the Caribbean in responses to hurricanes, for example. The South Pacific actually has a full range of types of disasters, natural disasters mainly, so volcanoes or floods or cyclones. And then the Caribbean, it tends to be a lot more just focused on the hurricane responses. But then the other place that we work is conflict zones. So places where supply chains have broken down, places that are inaccessible because of conflict. So we have responded in Syria, and as part of the conflict there, manufacturing originally search and rescue equipment locally using the kind of equipment you can find at a truck repair stop. Or in post-conflict scenarios like Iraq, where there was a very large number of young people who needed to find work, basically. During the COVID response, we've been working in very large refugee camps, say in Bangladesh, which is a hub for manufacturing for the world. But the refugee camps in Bangladesh are the biggest in the world. And the interesting thing about that context is that the Bangladesh government has required, for the first time, really, from the aid sector, that they buy local, rather than flying in supplies from the warehouses that aid agencies have around the world. They have to buy local. And so we've been quite active in making sure that some of the traditional aid products that have been used for decades are actually made in Bangladesh, rather than having to be brought in. So there's also a place where there may be, for Field Ready's work, where there are political constraints, often very favourable ones, to local production. So it's places where the supply chains are at their worst, conflict zones, islands, mountains, and political constraints. When you get to places like northern Uganda, northern Kenya, enormous refugee populations, very remote. Again, it's those questions of, is there the capacity to be able to make locally? And so we've done quite a bit of work on mapping manufacturing capacity in places like that.
Yeah, and I, with the concept of the research, we're having reservist cells, which are basically like the frontline maker labs or makers within community, and then kind of like linking them up with these manufacturing lines so that we can repurpose them. But I feel like the work that you're speaking to speaks within that sort of like that that intersection, that nexus there. And so within that work, like there's a lot to unpack when it comes to like the networking that's being done, the networks that are built around the work. And so can you kind of like talk about a little bit more about like what it is to work with the different governments and to kind of bridge those gaps between those frontline communities and perhaps the manufacturing.
The journey we've been on is that it started out with us responding as a traditional aid responder might, which is flying in people from outside with maker equipment to be able to manufacture on demand. Whilst that was impactful, it wasn't necessarily cheaper, better, faster, because it still depended on capabilities coming in from outside rather than building on local capabilities. So the journey we've been on is moving increasingly towards connecting supply and demand locally. I think there's two ways I would answer your question. One is that we have, during the COVID response, partnered with a group called Needs List, which is a way of listing needs of community organizations that say what they need, what their demands are. And in the COVID response, we were particularly looking for the kind of COVID supplies, PPE, items that stop the spread of COVID to help frontline workers. So we're working a lot with clinics, say, in schools. And then we worked with humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, which uses OpenStreetMap to map local manufacturing capabilities. So you can go now. We've published this on map.internetofproduction.org, and you can now go to a map and have a look at where sewing machines are across northern Uganda, or sewing machines are across northern Kenya. And the idea is, if you have a need listed for face masks or for soap or for hand washing stations on needs list, then we match that with a local production capability. We share open hardware designs for the product with them, and then they're able to produce that. Field Ready's role becomes one about quality control and being an intermediary, particularly on the cash flow side of things, to match the supply and demand locally. So there's still a need for Field Ready in terms of being an intermediary. The other way I'd answer your question is that I have never met a politician or a government official who does not want local manufacturing. They all love local manufacturing. They love job creation. They love the idea that that a crisis is an opportunity for local economic recovery and development, and are very aware that more livelihoods are lost in a disaster than lives. And there are many stories of businesses going bust, not because of the crisis, but because of the response to the crisis, where a soap factory in Vanuatu lost their market because the aid agencies were distributing free bars of soap. So, because after the Hurricane Winston, Hurricane Pam, the big hurricanes that happen so often in the South Pacific, lots of free soap was distributed, and so now Vanuatu depends on imports of soap into the country because the response destroyed the local market. And we've learned from the food aid experiences of the Ethiopian famine in the 80s that we need to support local farmers. We haven't yet learned, I think, in the aid sector that we need to support local manufacturers. And so politicians know this intuitively, governments know this intuitively. In the South Pacific, we've now managed to work with local factories to the extent that they have purchased their own tooling for products like this. Buckets, a traditional standard aid bucket, used to only be made in one place in Pakistan, in one factory in Pakistan, warehoused in Copenhagen in the UK, to then be shipped to Fiji. Well, we've now worked with the local factory. We loaned them a tool to make this, to go on their injection molding machines, but now they've bought their own, although in the process of buying their own tool, so that the Ministry of Health in Fiji can buy from the local factory in Fiji without us needing to be involved. And that's resilience. Now, that factory may not be producing that bucket day in, day out as their standard product, but they will do it to stockpile the buckets in advance of the hurricane. There's a season for it in the South Pacific, and they will do it in response to a crisis. They will pivot their production line to be making aid items. And that's a classic example of what we're trying to achieve.
Hmm. So yeah, so there's a continuity there, and I'm just trying to figure out like what is sort of the either it's a gap in knowledge or a pain point, because we're absolutely like affirming that there's infrastructure there on the ground through the manufacturers that are there. So there's equipment, there's training and things like that. Is there perhaps like a pain point around materials, or is it there something else that needs to be kind of affirmed when it comes to a different, like this evolving approach to humanitarianism?
Um, I think increasingly the pain point becomes around quality assurance and standards. So quality assurance in terms of it is, that factory that makes those buckets imports supplies of plastic because it's a factory that does injection molding, right? So it has a supply and a stockpile of the raw material. They have the skills, they have um, the organizational setup to be able to take large orders and manage that well, to cash flow it. But what's needed is to make sure that the product that they're making meets the quality that, say, the Ministry of Health or UNICEF is looking for, and that is something that Field Ready is sort of able to step in. We were the ones that selected that factory, as opposed to several of the other injection molding factories in PG, and that was an assessment process that we went through. The other part of it is in the COVID response was about standards. Now, I'm not sure that we need to go into that in too much depth, because I think everyone will appreciate that if you're making your own PPE, the standards bodies in a country will be interested in that, and you have a duty, I think, as a maker, to make sure that the product that you're making is safe. If you're making something for yourself, have at it, just like you would in your kitchen. Entirely up to you,
Mm-hmm.
But if you're making things to sell to other people, we have a professional responsibility as makers, I would argue, that we have to make sure that what we're distributing is safe. And so Field Ready's role is increasingly moving away from manufacturing itself towards helping do distributed quality assurance and quality control, and trying to make sure that some of the standards, some of the designs that we're working on meet local standards. So we often engage with, say, standards bodies in Uganda, for example, to make sure that the standards are there. I don't want to dismiss the other pain points of a crisis response, but actually you can overcome some of the pain points by deciding what to make. So if I was trying to make this bucket, even in a neighboring country from Fiji like Vanuatu, wouldn't be able to do it. So we don't make the bucket. We make other things. We make other products, and maybe out of wood, or we make privacy screens out of pandanus mats, or the leaves of the palm trees, because people go into collective centres and then don't have any privacy, so they need privacy screens in these centres. We'll find other things to make. And I think that's the beauty of it, is that resilient making shouldn't necessarily be about pushing a particular product. It should be about an approach that helps you to decide what can be made where, to have the biggest impact. The thing that I would really like to push back on in the maker movement sometimes is that the most effective things are not necessarily the most fun things to make. And so if there was an awful lot of work on ventilators and oxygen concentrators, say, after COVID-19, but actually bars of soap were missing in some of the places we were working, and soap is very easy to make. So I think that it's the triage of, we use 5 basic questions, really, maybe 4, 5. If there's more than, say, 3 or 4 different types of material, don't bother making it locally. there's assembly needed, and it gets a bit complicated. If there is electronics involved, don't bother making it locally. It's often cheaper to import finished electronics boards than trying to find electronic components locally in some of the places we work. If there's intellectual property attached to it, because Field Ready started in the US, we have a particular approach to intellectual property, but the idea would be that increasingly to open up hardware designs and use open hardware. Don't try to get into a fight over intellectual property, even in an emergency situation. But then the other thing is that do assess whether it is in fact cheaper. If the volume of the finished product is higher than the volume of the raw material, the raw material for this, a bucket, takes up a volume that you can hold, the plastic you can hold in one hand. But the volume of the finished product is much higher. So if the volume of the finished product is higher than the volume of the raw material, make it locally. If the volume is the same, say with plastic sheeting, don't bother, just ship it, because it's you're trying to do things cheaper, better, faster. And the traditional supply chains will eventually kick back in and supply those things.
Yeah,
that was a long answer to your question. I hope.
No. There's plenty to unpack there. I mean, and I'm just trying to decide where to take our conversation, because and well, the one thing that really popped out to me, especially when you're talking about working with more remote communities, rural communities, indigenous communities, the aspect of intellectual property, when you're thinking about and navigating these different concepts and who actually owns the designs. And then we have communal concepts of ownership as well. And so, I think that's kind of one of the challenges when we're dealing with a lot of open source philosophy, is that there's a lot of traditional knowledge out there that can be applicable to these types of scenarios, but it's not necessarily something that would be readily shared, because of the concept of extraction and everything from the communities. So just kind of thinking about how to approach those types of scenarios, not necessarily when there's the first to file patent in the United States, but actually how do you is traditional knowledge applied in these types of scenarios?
There's a preference, a bias, strong bias towards open hardware designs, open hardware licensing, and at Field Ready. And I would say that should generally be applied to emergency response. There isn't yet the political or even the donor backing to that, in the same way that we see generic medicines being made, and IP coming off, the campaigns fighting to remove patents on medicines so that generics can be made at much lower cost. We aren't seeing the same thing in emergency relief items or even medical devices yet. When it comes to traditional knowledge, the challenge there is not necessarily in the documentation and the generalization of it. The pandanus mats to make privacy screens in Vanuatu could just as easily be applied in the Caribbean, perhaps. It's more about the local capabilities and then the standards. So the pandanus mats that we were using to make privacy screens, it was quite hard to get them made at the same size, literally the same size and shape, so you can put them into a frame. Because actually the traditional approach is just to make a mat, and there was no sort of set specification for the size and shape of the mat. So there's a certain amount of the manufacturing approach meeting the traditional approach. But we have also supported at Field Ready local innovators to patent designs. So in Nepal, and a local innovator had spent 15 years iterating the design of a clean cook stove burner, and we helped him become one of the very few Nepali patent holders for this design, because it's what he spent 15 years of his life. We helped him over a course of a few weeks with some 3D printing to make the molds so that he can create the equipment he needed for the sand casting process to make the cook stove burners, the metal cook stove burners. It wasn't our role to try and patent that and to help enforce them, or to even put an open hardware license on it. What we have done is say, in a particular place, say in the South Pacific, with a field toilet that we have, a rotomolded field toilet, in a particular geographic region, then your company is the one that we will contract with and enforce it. So we actually just sort of commit to working with one manufacturer in a particular geography. But then in the rest of the world, where that manufacturer doesn't operate, sure, open hardware, crack on, but it really depends on who came up with the design, and just respecting that. The point about resilient making is that we need networks of manufacturers that will respect the design of where something came from. So if a designer in Kenya comes up with a medical device and then really wants to make money out of it, out of that design as it gets scaled up around the world, that designer really at the moment only has the option of going to the patent system. That's not a great thing to be able to do as a small local designer. The patents, why would you try to enforce patents? If you're a maker in Kenya, why would you be trying to enforce your patents in the Philippines? Or that, it just doesn't work. So we need in the Internet of Production to be able to have ways of helping makers and designers to be able to sort of own their intellectual property and share it. And to be able to say, if you're using it for a crisis response, there's no license fee, just make it for free. But if you're using it to sell commercially to hardware stores or to supermarkets, there will be a license fee. So to be able to nuance the licensing as well. Am I answering your question, Jean-Luc? I fear I now deviated away from the local knowledge.
No. It's really helpful, and I think that there's just so much to unpack even from the answer before. So what I'm kind of curious about is sort of like that culture shift, that especially from the maker movement. Because one of the rules that you alluded to earlier was about if there's electronics that are involved, it's better to ship that into the country than to produce that.
As a rule of thumb, yes.
Yeah, and I think that with the maker movement, that there is a focus on sort of like electronics and tools production and things like this, and so we do see like those interventions of the ventilators and so forth. So.
Remember, I'm just to add on to what you're saying. I'm talking about context where Field Ready is working, which is places that have bad supply chains. It's quite hard to get electronics components in Fiji or Vanuatu or Nepal. Most of the components you would get that makers use come from e-waste.
Okay. Yeah, but
so in the UK or in the US or in Europe, absolutely do stuff with electronics. If it's available, build on local capabilities.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about like how to, and I think that's the question, is like how to balance that, because there is a need for like the access to the tools, and like with in an emergency crisis scenario, it might be, that might be one of the pain points of like trying to like import in more tools. And so like from the United States European perspective, like it would probably be a good intervention to kind of like have like all the electronic components, and you can cobble something together. But it's a really it sounds like it's a really challenging question in other local contexts. So how do you balance that? I mean, I think it's part of it is how you're answering with
Yeah.
needs list, but like what are some other tools to be able to kind of balance that out?
I think the one that Field Ready uses most directly is quite a simple answer. Even though we're an international organization, we make sure we hire local people. And those local people, or local businesses, they know what their supply chains are like.
Mm.
And that will very quickly, you can say, well, can we make a pulse oximeter? No. Like, it's just like, right, we'll rule that out. Can we 3D print forceps? Yes. Crack on. Like, it's a very quick thing if you have local people, and that really is, to me, what the Resilient Maker Stories is about. Is trying to encourage stories of local resilience, rather than, say, international organizations like Field Ready coming in and trying to figure that stuff out in a context where they would be new. When I hear about the ideas, advice that's being put together by Sabrina Merlot and the Nation of Makers movement around the National Manufacturing Reserve in the US, a political advocacy idea. And when I hear about, there's a guy called Matt Norris who proposed the idea of hardened maker spaces. He's from Oklahoma, where they have a lot of tornadoes. And the idea that a makerspace should be a hardened facility so that they can survive tornadoes, and then help to mount a response afterwards. A lot of that should also come attached with a warehouse of materials and components if you're going to be able to respond very quickly. So part of the answer is, in terms of that balance, is reduce complexity as much as you can, focus on the simple and effective items, work with local teams who know the context so you get to answers very quickly, but also begin to look at warehousing and stockpiling material, or encouraging local manufacturers like this bucket factory in Fiji to maintain a certain level of stock. If they can't afford that themselves, then you might need to step in and help them. And for an individual maker in northern Uganda, their stock is basically whatever's available in the local market. And, there's often quite a good stock available there. When a crisis happens, that stock can deplete pretty quickly. So it is about sort of then adjusting to, well, what else can we make? Or how else can we do this? In Vanuatu, when I was responding to a volcano eruption, the Ambai volcano eruption, with my colleague Addy, we did we went out to do an assessment of what we could do. Well, the assessment very quickly turned into a response, because we were asked to provide beds to a evacuation center for people with disabilities and older, vulnerable people, pregnant women, old people. And we were asked to provide beds because they were sleeping on a concrete floor. And therefore, some of these people couldn't get up in the night, couldn't lift themselves up in the night to go to the bathroom, for example. Leading to questions of dignity and questions of dependency on volunteers and so on. Mm-hmm. There were no beds. We couldn't find the materials to make beds, whatever. But what we did realize is that these people didn't need. They weren't asked. They weren't. Beds is what they were asking for. But a bed is a solution, right? What they wanted was to not sleep on the floor. A bed is a solution to that problem. what we realized is some of the materials were available: concrete blocks, battens, plywood sheets from the local hardware store, where what we made wasn't beds, but platforms. And we made enormous, great big long platforms that filled the evacuation center, where people could sleep on these platforms and spin around and stand up for themselves. We borrowed the material from the hardware store for 6 weeks while the evacuation center was open. We didn't cut, we didn't nail, we didn't, change the material. When those 6 weeks were over, the material went back on the shelf at the hardware store. We didn't even purchase it. We just borrowed it. We borrowed this plywood. So a lot of it is about thinking about how you can make the product with the materials that are available by changing the frame of the question. Don't design for the solution, design for solving the problem.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, and I think, like, we've actually, like, through this conversation, we've walked through sort of like traditional approaches of airdropping makers, airdropping different
Yeah.
solutions. And now we're getting to a point where we're actually kind of like affirming the dignity of the end user. And so I just wanted to kind of like spend a little bit of time on that, in terms of like the lived experience of the end user and how that actually feeds back to the adaptation of the intervention, such as the platform. I just kind of wanted to give like a little bit of a picture about like more personal, individual level about the end user and what that feedback loop is like in your work.
I think there's a big problem in disaster relief and in the humanitarian sector at large, that we see the people who have been affected by a crisis as only being vulnerable. And we have in the mainstream humanitarian sector people who spend their entire lives doing vulnerability assessments, and there are even lots of innovations around tools to help do sort of map vulnerability and predict vulnerability to crisis. I think we should be doing a much better job of understanding the capabilities of people who are affected by crisis. You will find in any disaster affected community seamstresses, carpenters, welders, electricians, plumbers, teachers, designers, entrepreneurs. You will be able to find these people, and you can mobilize them to help you in a response, particularly if you get to a point where we're trying to make this thing, can you help us? So you can mobilize them. But even before that, in a design process, if you have the time, and actually I would argue, I advocate for minimizing the amount of time you spend on design in a crisis, so that you can maximize the same amount of time you spend on production, because it's only when you make things that you actually have an impact, or a humanitarian impact, I should say. A design process can have an educational impact, but it won't necessarily have a life-saving impact. You can engage with people in the design process. So we have worked on putting, say, I've got some here, toys inside bars of soap to encourage children to wash their hands. We didn't design that product. We had the idea, we had a thesis that if we put toys inside bars of soap, that children might want to wash their hands more, and it turns out to have been spectacularly effective. But the designers for that process were the refugee children, the IDP children living in camps in northern Iraq, the Yazidi refugees that we were engaging with. We held a workshop with them, whether we asked them, well, what do the toys need to look like? What do the soaps need to look like? What colors do you use? What do you like? And they became the designers of the product. And that was working with Save the Children, the London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine. So it's a managed process. You have to be careful when you're engaging with vulnerable people, trying to, extract ideas and talents and capabilities from them. You have to, be careful about how to frame that and manage that. And you may even need ethical approval from various authorities to be able to do so. But in an ideal world, it's the people who are affected that should become the people who determine their own development, and that they should be the ones who realize their own resilience. So they should be the designers rather than the passive consumers of aid supplies. And we've recently submitted a bid with UNICEF. This is through an initiative called the Local Procurement Learning Partnership, which is this is a report we did about something else, but the Local Procurement Learning Partnership has recently submitted a bid to UNICEF to team up with their Voices for Change program, which essentially gives refugees the opportunity to give feedback on the products and on the projects that UNICEF delivers to them. So we're now trying to team up with them to say, can we do mass customization of, say, generic kits like wash and dignity and hygiene kits for keeping people healthy. These are the kits with bars of soap and toothbrushes and toothpastes and things like that inside, and buckets. But to be able to get their feedback into the design process, so that we're not just handing out generic aid items in every country in the world. We can customize it and locally produce it. So I think the aid sector is now getting on board with the idea that the people affected by crisis should have a say in what they receive. It just so happens that has traditionally been done much better in the area of food aid than it has in the aid of finished products.
Yeah, it's and I'm just going to inject my personal experience into this just for a second. Not really like a journalist or anything. I'm just a researcher, right?
Yeah.
But I while you're talking about all of this, I'm thinking very much about like my own experience, my family's experience, not necessarily like the products, but like the food aspect of it, and the food that we get in terms of like rations when it comes to like hurricane response or anything like this. There's just like there's something that it's like, oh, okay, it reaffirms the trauma of the situation, and it impacts the dignity of the person. And so like going from food into actual products that we use to maintain quality of life, there's how do you and you're probably already talking about this, but definitely like how do we kind of like ensure that the stigma of the crisis, it does not become embedded in the product that we're hoping to promote resiliency of the community.
Absolutely. I think that the idea of giving people the power to create, the ability for them to become the masters of their own destiny, as it were, rather than being a passive recipient of aid. I think people who create are happier than people who consume, and I think that's true anywhere, and a really powerful motivation for becoming a maker. That you are independent, more independent and more resilient in that way. I think that one of the things, I was in a meeting this morning about recycling plastic for shelter solutions, and the question came up is, should we emphasize circularity? Should we emphasize sustainability? And whilst you might do that to a donor or to a humanitarian aid agency, you could talk about sustainability and circularity of recycling plastic to make shelter products. The last thing the recipient of an aid product wants to know about is often sustainability. It's like, no, we don't want to sustain this. We don't want this to be sustained. I would love for all building materials to be made out of recycle products, right, rather than just constantly consuming the world's resources. But I don't necessarily think it is for the aid sector to take that lead. I think it's for the manufacturing sector to lead the way there, and for us to change the paradigm of production outside aid, rather than trying to say, well, we need to sustain this response. We're trying to avoid language like that, where people get the impression that they might be receiving this handout for the next 10 years. So resilience is a good way to think about it. The question of shame and trauma is a really challenging one. And in fact, one of the things I really hope to achieve through creating networks of local manufacturers and finding ways to give people the infrastructures for the power to create is that people can recover some of their own dignity, but making things can also become an external. We hear about sort of people expressing their trauma, processing their trauma through art or music or song a lot, but it can also be through making things, because it's outside of yourself, it's objective. There's ways that you can use that as a kind of therapy. And certainly, when I've had a bad day, I'll go to my shed at the bottom of the garden and do something with my hands for a while. That makes me feel better. I don't want to compare that to someone who's living through the horrors of a conflict or an earthquake, but there is something about the psychosocial value of making, which I think is really important.
Yeah, thank you for that. And in our last few minutes, now that we started off this conversation, you kind of acknowledging the transition in your work and everything. I just wanted to kind of get just a couple of minutes about sort of reflecting on all of this, like what is the pathway forward for yourself? Like, what are the new opportunities that you see in your work going forward?
I think over the last 10 years since I've been involved in Field Ready, I think actually a lot of the question of local capabilities has been answered. We now see digital fabrication technologies in most of the places we work, even in remote areas. The maker movement, even the Fab Lab movement, has been reaching more and more of the planet. So I think now the thing that needs to be worked on is networking that capacity together, so that we can move from a paradigm of mass production and global supply to a paradigm of production by the masses and local response, local supply. So that's what the Internet of Production is going to try and do, is create some of the infrastructures we need to be able to network together large numbers of local producers to be able to respond. And really that the Internet of Production is part of the answer to the question of how we scale Field Ready's work. I'm just not going to be spending time at Field Ready beyond this week anymore. I'm going to be working on trying to create this network. And there are projects that, like the Make Africa and EU project for digital innovation hubs, makeafricaeu.org, the Make project, which is about trying to network together maker spaces across Europe and Africa. Not necessarily for humanitarian response, but it could those networks could be mobilized to become humanitarian response. So I think there's projects like that that are giving some hope there. Part of it is trying to get the aid sector to buy locally, which is what this local procurement learning partnership is about. The aid sector needs to learn how to buy locally and needs to have policies that favor local production, because just saying something is cheaper, better, faster doesn't actually change things. Because the procurement process generally in most organizations is a global one. So if you can find that product for cheaper in China or India, then actually you would often buy it in those places and then ship it, because the cost of shipping is dealt with by another department. Like it's something you can externalize. That has to change in the aid sector. I think the other thing that has to be developed, and I'm on the board of Apropedia and Helpful Engineering, is that we need and Field Ready's on a lot of this, is that we need a larger catalogue of ready-made open hardware designs. Mm-hmm. And we need to have better ways of showing that they exist in the world. Because as we saw in the pandemic, everyone was designing PPE. And actually what we needed was people to make PPE. So I think the default reaction of a resilient maker would be, the first thing you should do is look for designs that already exist, rather than, we have in the maker movement a very strong culture of being a creator, of being a designer. When you're responding to a crisis, you have to put that to one side and get products out the door, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the idea of being less of a designer and more of a manufacturer, a producer, becomes really important. So I'm thinking about ideas about trying to create a prize for plagiarism, right? Like to try and encourage the reuse of designs that already exist, because to do so saves time and therefore can save lives. We need networks, we need more local procurement on behalf of the aid sector and governments to buy locally, and we need more open hardware designs that are ready to go, that are quality checked. What other aspect of it? I think the pandemic has really changed the political agenda around local production in every country, and there's a lot of question about resilience of supply chains. I think the other thing that needs to happen is we need to make sure that the maker response is not just seen as a nice thing on the side, but actually a real solution. And I hope the projects like yours, the Reservist project, can really help to make that case, that this isn't just plan C or plan B, but it can be the way things are made in the future.
Well, as with all of your answers, like it's just so rich, and there's so much to unpack, but like we are at the hour. So I just wanted to just say thank you so much. I mean, this has been a really great conversation, and deeply appreciate it. It's been very helpful.
Well, thank you. And if you do have any further comments or questions, you can contact me at andrew.lamb@internetofproduction.org, or through LinkedIn and so on. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, and as a matter of fact, that's a great segue, because we also, for everybody that's been listening to us on YouTube, the couple of guests that we've had on the live Zoom chat, we actually have a Miro board where people can go and start to kind of fill in, listen to these stories, and then kind of like provide feedback for us. So kind of like following the same structure of storytelling that we did within this conversation, but then being able to map out their own experiences. And then talking about like how they experience the activity. This is something that I think that we're going to continue beyond the initial set of maker stories, and hopefully we can grow this through the research project. And so we're going to have a collective map of emergency crisis scenarios and how people navigated them, for the interventions and how they networked. And so we're definitely going to be scaling this intervention through the series. But next week we're going to have Adriana Cabrera. So really looking forward to her. We're going to go back to our regular time of 16 hours local Barcelona time. But yeah, just one more time, thank you, thank you, thank you, and it's been a pleasure.
Well, I really appreciate this, and good luck with the Reservist project. It's what the world needs. Thank you.